What is up, everybody, and welcome to the July tier list for Command & Conquer Rivals. Now, I know you guys have been hoping for one of these. The reason I didn't do a June one, I just didn't think there'd been enough changes in the metagame for a June one to make sense. Honestly, even with July, there's still not that many changes, but I didn't want to go 2 months without doing a tier list, so without further ado, let's move on to the tier list. Now, as usual, we're going to start by talking about what do the tiers mean. So we're going to stick with the same ones we've been using for a while now. S tier, God tier units, probably overpowered. These things probably need a nerf, but it's not guaranteed need a nerf, but like these are the dominant forces in the metagame right now. Pretty strong units and potentially overpowered units. A tier is very strong units. Again, these might be overpowered. Some of these A tier units probably need a nerf, but it's things that you're less likely to see than S tier. They're not like core units in the metagame. They're not like key parts of the metagame, but they are very, very strong and you will see them regularly. But they're not, they're not the cornerstones of the metagame. B tier units are good units. These are solid good units. These probably don't need a change in any way. They're just strong. They're good as they are. They probably don't need a nerf or a buff. These are if the game was perfectly balanced, I think everything would be in B tier. Basically, that's what B tier means. C tier is things that you can play. Like you can. There's no reason. Like there's no argument against C tier. Like if you have a C tier unit in your deck, I'm not going to be like, wow, you shouldn't be playing that. But they're probably not as good as S, B, and A tier units. So sometimes they're role players. Sometimes they're just like fine units, but they're not great, but they're not terrible either. I'm not saying these units that suck. I'm just saying that they're probably not great in the metagame. You probably shouldn't play them right now. And then D tier, these are the ones that I think are just terrible. Like D tier units, I think are rubbish. You probably just shouldn't really ever play them. There's almost always going to be a better option available to you than playing these units. Again, some of these units are quite powerful. Like a classic example of D tier unit that I have at the moment is like a disruptor. Obviously, once your opponent gets to a point where they have disruptors plus other stuff, it's really hard to win. If a disruptor reaches your base, you'll die. But generally speaking, disruptor isn't really worth playing, so it ends up in D tier. Finally, I'd like to say once again that of course my tier list is based on competitive play. So this is like high ladder play and tournaments, but it won't necessarily reflect your experiences. Alright, so the first one we're going to look at is the Commander tier list. Here is the previous Commander tier list, and here's the new one. Not a lot has changed in the Commander tier listings. Liang is still the best Commander by a mile. All other GDI Commanders are way down there just because nothing comes close to competing with Liang. There's basically no reason to play anything but Liang. It's just the best by a mile. Then you've got Oksana and Seth are the two key Nod commanders. They're just the best. They're better than Jade and Kayn by a lot. Almost every deck plays Oksana or Seth. Then in B tier, you've got Jackson and Solomon. These are both fine commanders. They're just not as good as Liang by a lot. But they both have roles to play. There are aggressive decks that want to play Solomon, and there are tech decks where you want to boost your tech units that want to have Jackson. And so these are both playable commanders, but you should pretty much just always play Liang. Strong Arm is now in C, not because Strong Arm is terrible, but just because it's worse. There's almost no deck you can build where you should play Strong Arm instead of one of the other three commanders. Like, Strong Arm just doesn't really have a place right now. And then finally, the only movement really today on the tier list, I've put Jade in D. I know some of you aren't going to like this, but Jade only base kills. That's all Jade does. Jade is terrible in combat, like really, really bad. At high tier play, Jade Missile in combat is rubbish. It will always get dodged, or it will not gain anywhere near enough value or tempo to be worth using. I actually think Jade is worse than Kayn now. Kayn can be really powerful in some matchups, and can be really good at killing things like Zone Troopers or Titans or Rockworms. If you Fnatic boost Kayn, it can be really powerful. If you snipe a couple of Stealth Tanks with Kayn, it can be worth playing. Kayn, potentially, I could have moved to C tier, but I still think he's not worth really playing. So he is still in D. But I think Kayn is now better than Jade. I think Jade is officially the worst commander in the game. So I guess congrats by default, Kayn. You're no longer the worst, but you're still in D tier, fam. So probably should get some buffs. Alright, let's move on to Nod. Here you can see my previous Nod tier list, and here is the new one. As you can see, again, not a lot of movement. The metagame just hasn't changed. I firmly believe we're now in a solved metagame. At this point, the metagame simply is Razorback, Missile, and Fnatic Stank. Those are the 2 best decks. You can play decks that beat one of those 2, but there's nothing that beats both of them. If you play one deck that's good against one, it'll probably be terrible versus the other. That's just the way it is. So I do believe the metagame has been solved for a while now. So there hasn't been a huge change in the tier listings. However, I finally put the Phantom in S tier. For a long time, I thought the Phantom was too strong. I finally put it in S tier now. That unit is so good. It's actually insane how good the Phantom is. It just utterly demolishes all air fights. You just always have complete air superiority with a Phantom in your deck. The unit is nuts. The only thing keeping it out of S tier up until now has been the simple fact that Phantom just wasn't that, it wasn't necessarily as good as Stealth Tank, because a lot of decks wanted to kill Razorbacks in one volley, and Phantom doesn't do that. But there's more decks coming out now that just simply beat Razorback by not being weak to it. They play things like Chemical Buggy and Buggy to fight infantry, so they avoid losing to the Razorback. And these decks can play Phantom, and if you can play Phantom, you should play Phantom, because it's just better. The unit is just insane. You play Stealth Tank when you need to protect your Fanatics from Razorback, otherwise you should just play Phantom. So I finally put it in S tier. The next change, the Rockworm is now in A tier. The Rockworm is broken, man. The Rockworm is a broken ass unit. This thing is so dumb. Ever since it got AoE damage, it's just been busted. It should really be an S tier, but I'm not comfortable putting it in S tier yet, just because it is very weak in some matchups. When it's strong, it's utterly dominant. It's better than an Avatar, I think. It's better. It's so much cheaper than an Avatar, and it basically beats all ground, just like an Avatar does. Obviously, it doesn't have Raider. It's a little bit awkward when it moves, so it's not as good, but the unit is definitely broken. It just annihilates ground. It's super dumb. It also is now bugged. Somehow the unit has become bugged. It now blocks ground units when it's underground, which is nuts. You have an indestructible unit blocking your opponent from moving. I don't know how they've managed to do this, but the Rockworm is now completely broken, actually bugged. Should really be an S tier, but like I say, I don't think it's quite there yet. But the unit is busted. The only reason it's not an S tier is because it's awkward movement and the fact that it's in the Nod Tech lab and you don't really want to play Nod Tech a lot of the time. But yeah, Rockworm is super dumb, so it's in A tier now. Some other changes. I've put an asterisk on the Laser Drone. This is just to remind me to say to you guys, Laser Drone is basically S tier versus Nod and C or D tier versus GDI. It's insanely good versus Nod and it's kind of trash versus GDI, so that's why it's in B tier. Not because it's a balanced unit, because it's super dumb. It is just really dumb against Nod. It's just it's so bad versus GDI. The middle ground for it is B tier because it's so good versus Nod, but terrible versus GDI. I have no idea how to fix this. You can make it worse versus Nod, and then it's just a terrible unit. Or you can make it better versus GDI, and it's completely bonkers busted. I don't know what to do with Laser Drone, honestly. The Nod just needs a way to deal with Laser Drones. That's the issue. Maybe Banshee needs to be 40 and have less stats, but so it's an early answer to Laser Drones. I don't know. But anyway, moving on. That's why there's an asterisk on the Laser Drone. Chems are in B tier now. This is for 2 reasons. Firstly, Razorback is the best deck. Chems suck versus Razorback. They previously were in A tier because they were good versus the Fnatic decks, but I think people are learning to deal with them a little bit better, and people have started playing Buggy decks. Buggy is now a thing, and Buggy is pretty good versus Chems. It gives Nod a way to beat up on both Chems and Laser Drones. Buggy beats both of those units. So Buggy has made a bit of an appearance, and it's made the Chems worse, so they're down in B tier. Speaking of Buggy, Buggy's now up in B tier. As I was saying, the Buggy, it's pretty good in these, basically the 2 things have happened is GDI is playing Razorback, and Nod decks are either trying to beat Razorback by playing Fnatic Stank, or they're trying to cannibalize other Nod decks by playing Chems and Laser Drones. They're trying to beat the Fnatic decks. Buggy allows you to beat both of those things, sort of. Not really. I'm not saying Buggy's the answer. It's not the savior we're looking for. But it allows you to have good game against these expensive Razorback decks that are trying to go to Titan, because their early game is weak. Their early game is Razorback Missile, and Buggy allows you to kill the missiles without losing to the Razorback. And then you can make a Scorpion to kill Pitbulls, and you can win the early game very easily against these slow GDI decks. And then also, Buggy is decent versus Laser Drone and Chem. So you manage to avoid this normal awkwardness of being weak to chems and laser drones when you're playing Nod. So Buggy is not bad now. Still not good. It's like a fine minus unit. It's still like you're still going to lose a lot of matchups where people have like, things like Shade or Scorpion Tank. It's not going to be very useful. But it's in a weird spot in the metagame right now where Buggy is actually not terrible. And then finally, Flame Tank is in B tier. Flame Tank could probably also be an A or S tier unit. The reason Flame Tank is in B, it's a very strong unit. 90 cost is insane for how strong this thing is. Its infantry DPS is out of this world. It does reasonably well against light vehicles. It's really fast. It's really cheap. But it's not as good as a Rockworm. And I didn't feel comfortable putting it in A tier when Rockworm was in A tier. Like, if I put Flame Tank in A, Rockworm would have to be in S. And I didn't think Rockworm deserved S. So, Flame Tank is in B because Rockworm is in A, and it's way better than Flame Tank. Because Rockworm is super duper busted. And again, you don't really want to play Nod Tech that much. So, Flame Tank, really good. Not sure if it should be in B. Not super comfortable about this one, but it's definitely a good unit now. So, probably should be in, like, A. Anyway, it's in B for now, but it could definitely be A. Alright, let's move on to GDI. Here's GDI before. Here is GDI now. So, a few changes again. Not too many, but a few. First things first, zones are now S tier. They've probably just been S tier for a really long time. It just took me a while to really grasp how stupid zone troopers are. Like, the more you play, the more I've played with zone troopers and the more I've played against really good players using zone troopers, it's so hard to kill a zone trooper. This is also part of the Razorback meta. Now that you can't use flames and shocks in this metagame. They're just terrible versus fanatics and Razorbacks. So one of the few units in the game that actually kills zone troopers, which is flames and shocks, are basically unplayable. So zones are insane. Zones beat fanatics 1v1, they beat militants and rifles 1v1, they beat basically every aircraft and vehicle in the game 1v1 except like Shatterer, which is a terrible unit, so you're not going to see Shatterer very often. They just beat everything. The best combination of units in the game at the moment is probably Zone Trooper plus Zone Trooper. Like, they're just stupid. The only things they lose to is like multiple Razorbacks stacked together, which is the best unit in the game, and Flame Tank or Disruptor, which is the tech anti-infantry unit. Oh, and I guess Confessors. But like, Flame Tank's pretty good. If you have a Zone Trooper deck and you run into Flame Tank, you're going to be sad, and you're going to lose to it. But like, Disruptor's not very good. So, that and Confessor, I just don't think you're going to see them that often. So, it's like, zones are just nuts right now. Zones are crazy. They're way too strong. They need a big old nerf. They're crazy good. They beat Borkers, they beat Infernos, they beat everything, man. They're just nuts. Weirdly, they're kind of weak to Drone Swarm, because Drone Swarm is a 5-man squad. But other than that, zones are crazy good. So, yeah, they're in S tier. They need a nerf. They're stupid. Moving on. Titan is now A tier. I actually think the Titan metagame is on the way out. Titan is trending downwards rather than upwards. But the more I've played against Titan and with Titan in practice games and such, if you have Liang and a Titan comes out, it will never die. It's basically impossible to kill a Titan if there's a Liang healing it. It just will never die. So once that first Titan comes out, you have to win the game before it is relevant to the game. Because once it's on the pads, that's just a pad you're never getting back ever again. Because that Titan will never die. It's so dumb. It has so many hit points. It lives forever with Liang Drone. Without Liang Drone, Titan is whatever. Just to be clear. It's the combination of Liang and Titan and Razorback that makes it completely busted. Without Liang, Titan would be like C tier maybe. Probably maybe B, but probably C. With Liang, it's super dumb. It never dies, so I put it in A tier. I've resisted this for a long time, but yeah, with Liang, it's specifically with Liang. Without Liang, it's probably still a C tier unit. But I'm moving more towards these tier lists being based on what kind of decks these units are played in. So like Fnatic Stank didn't used to be S tier because Stanks weren't S tier without Fnatic boosts. Now I'm leaning more towards my tier lists being more about what kind of decks exist and what units are the problem units within those decks. So now that I'm looking at it more like that, I'm thinking Titan Liang, that's stupid. Titan's S plus tier. Liang's S plus tier. Titan with Liang is probably like A tier. Alright, so Mammoth is now in C tier. Mammoth could honestly be B tier, could be D tier. It loses to Titans, which are pretty popular right now. And it's 250. Like, if you play an all-in Mammoth deck, it's pretty hard to build that Mammoth tank in a relevant time. Like, you normally lose the game before the Mammoth comes out, even on 2.5, because it's so expensive now. And then sometimes you'll run into a Titan player and you'll still lose because their tech unit beats yours. So the more Titans being around and Mammoth costing more has made me think that Mammoth is just not very good anymore, so I put it in C. Rhino's in C as well. Good job, Rhino, you've moved up a tier. Rhino is like a bad buggy. So it has some of the same traits that I was talking about with the buggy, but it's nowhere near as good as buggy. Like, so honestly, Rhino could still be D, but I've put it in C because I think it's not completely unplayable, but it kind of sucks. And then finally, I've moved Sandstorm to D. Yeah, there's just no reason to play any GDI tech except Titan and Zone Trooper, basically. Those two are just so far ahead of all the others. Sandstorm, I think Sandstorm's kind of balanced now. What needs to happen now is the other tech units need to be brought in line with things like Sandstorm, and then it'll make more sense. So the reason Sandstorm's in D is because, like, why would you ever play Sandstorm over Zones? Zones are so much better than Sandstorm right now. That's kind of why Sandstorm's in D. If Zones weren't so obnoxiously overpowered, Sandstorm would probably be okay. There's just there's no reason to use it when Zone Trooper exists. It's just Zone Trooper is so much better. Alright guys, so that's the final tier list for July. Got it out right at the end of July here. Hope you guys enjoyed that, and I'm sure you'll have many disagreements for me in the comments, so I'm very much looking forward to those. Alright guys, see you next time.